Good day to you all, and welcome to this Balfour Project event. And I'm very glad to say that we have more than 820 people registered to join us today. That's a tribute to the quality of our speakers and to the importance of our chosen theme. Jerusalem is a special place for all of us. The title of our conference is Jerusalem, from past divisions to a shared future, with a question mark. And that question mark itself is very important. I spent 3 years in Jerusalem. It was spiritually uplifting and politically headbanging. The Balfour Project charity comes at this issue from an equal rights perspective, and with an eye to British responsibility to work for equal rights, which our government historically has not always done, to put it mildly, diplomatically. I am an ex-diplomat. The questions we ask today are: can we establish the facts, the truth of the situation? Historical, legal, religious, and actual. Then, can we explore the prospects for positive change, or more of the same? When more of the same means entrenching inequality. And third, what should Britain say and do to advance equal rights and peaceful coexistence and inclusivity? By Britain, I mean government, parliament, and civil society. All of us. Not acting alone, but acting, and doing so in concert with like-minded people elsewhere in Europe, in the United States, in Israel, and in Palestine. But this charity's work begins at home, raising awareness here in the United Kingdom and advocating steps by us to advance equal rights there. In so many ways, Jerusalem is the heart of the matter. And that is not to neglect Gaza or the West Bank. Gaza was the theme of our 2 Balfour Project conferences in Scotland in 2019. Today, our speakers will seek to put Jerusalem back on the table, for there will be no solution to this conflict without an inclusive outcome on Jerusalem, sharing the future. We seek the peace of Jerusalem. And now, some guidance on how the day will run. Diana Safier, our excellent Balfour Project Programs Coordinator, and her colleague Edith Perman will run the day, with Edith monitoring the chat box for your written questions, while Diana, whose beautiful and informative conference brochure I commend on our website, will manage the transitions between the sessions. If you have a question, write it in the chat. Ian Black will put those questions, or as many as he can, to a panel at 5:20. We can't answer them all, but Ian will try to select themes and common strands of interest. And here is an important fact. A full video recording of our day together will be on the Balfour Project website tomorrow, the 28th. We would love you to spend your day with us in our good company, but if you can't, the full recording will be available soon. And a full written transcript of the day will be available next month. And now it's my honor to introduce a video message from His Royal Highness Prince Hassan bin Talal of Jordan, a man who cares deeply about Jerusalem. Here is his message to us.
Dear friends of Jerusalem, I commend the Balfour Project for convening this timely and important conference with its impressive array of speakers, friends of Jerusalem all. It was Benjamin Disraeli, a Sephardic Jew who converted to Anglicanism and reputedly died a Roman Catholic, who gave us one of the most evocative descriptions of Old Jerusalem when he visited in the early years of the 19th century. What need, he said, of cascade and of cataract, the deep green turf, the foliage of the fairest trees, the impenetrable forest, the abounding river, mountains of glaciered crest, all sights and sounds of material loveliness. They would not be observed as the eyes seized on Calvary and Sion, the gates of Bethlehem and Damascus, the hill of Titus, the mosque of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the tomb of Christ. The view of Jerusalem is the history of the world. It is more. It is the history of earth and heaven. It is a history that is also deeply entwined with that of my own family. As Sharif of Mecca and King of Hijaz, my great-grandfather, Sharif Hussein, presided over the principal routes of pilgrimage. Respect for each other's holy places was ingrained in the tradition of hospitality and watering and sanctuary. This hereditary duty directly links Mecca with the Esplanade, the glorious Esplanade, and the holy sites. I want to say that leaping forward for the sake of brevity, Jerusalem, the city, may have been holy to the three great monotheistic religions simultaneously for 13 centuries. But tragically, despite long periods during which Jerusalemites lived peacefully with their neighbors, immigrants of many nationalities and pilgrims, as can be seen in Félix Bonfils' early photographs of the inhabitants side by side, without concern for difference in religion, sect, or origin, this has not proved a consolidating factor. On the contrary, at times it has exacerbated political differences. Even now, the holiness of the city does not ensure an agreed solution for its future. Only the legal arguments offer a dispassionate and neutral route out of the labyrinth, a counterbalance to the partisan nature of the political polemic and the dogmatic quality of so much of the religious debate. If we should never forget Jerusalem's religious and heritage status, and I recall the wonderful bird's-eye view of Jerusalem highlighting its global significance by the Flemish painter, engraver, and mapmaker Frans Hogenberg in 1575, including mosque, church, and synagogue, we should also bear in mind that the city is also a temporal entity, inhabited by real human beings, whose basic human dignity has already been relentlessly eroded by politics. Unfortunately, the situation has been deteriorating rapidly in recent times. May I conclude these few remarks by saying that I have been a lifelong friend of the United Kingdom. I deeply admire its fundamental values and principles, including the upholding of the rule of law. Speaking as a friend, I should add that though British interest in Jerusalem has not always translated into attention to the well-being and equal treatment of all Jerusalem's residents, today, owing to exclusivist policies, the fate of the city concerns us all, with its rich social fabric, a city that means so much to the peoples of the Abrahamic faiths, and to the whole world. Through this message of goodwill, of mutual respect and peaceful coexistence, I would like to speak above all to the online audience and those who will follow these proceedings, to those concerned British people who worry about current negative trends and can make their voices heard in calls to those responsible for a change of direction before it is too late. Thank you.
Can I thank His Royal Highness for that intervention, that heartfelt intervention, in which he mentioned so many things, including the legal status of the city, which we will touch upon in our second session. May I now hand over to my friend and colleague, Andrew Whitley, a fellow trustee of the Balfour Project and member of our executive committee, who will take us through the first session of the day on the history of the city and of the conflict. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Vincent, and thanks to everyone for joining this conference today. It's my honor to be the chair of this first session on history, and what a history it is. Anyone who has been to Jerusalem, and I have the privilege of living there for 7 years, knows what a wonderful history it is and how one cannot escape that history. Going back to the first and second temples, to the city of David, to the times of Jesus Christ, his crucifixion and resurrection, and of course, to the... Hello?
We can hear you, Andrew. Carry on.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I thought there was a technical problem there. So I simply want to be able to set the scene here today to say that history is an inescapable subject in Jerusalem, but it's one which is so contentious that we need expert guides to talk us through it. Today we shall be focusing on the modern era of Jerusalem, from the late Ottoman period through to the Mandate period and up to today. And to guide us on this journey, we have 4 distinguished historians and international relations experts deeply familiar with the city and with the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. Before introducing them, I would like to make 2 practical points. The first one Vincent has already mentioned, but it bears repeating, is that there will be no Q&A at the end of this session. Instead, please put your questions in the chat box and we'll try to tackle them at the end. Secondly, to inform everyone online that we are not, of course, charging you for this conference, but we would much appreciate any contributions that you're able to make to the running of the Balfour Project, which is a charity and depends largely on volunteers. Our speakers today are going to be in this order. We will begin with the distinguished Emeritus Professor of International Relations, Avi Shlaim from Oxford. He will give us the keynote speech. After him, we will have Professor Salim Tamari, editor of the Jerusalem Quarterly from Birzeit University, and he will talk about the late Ottoman and early Mandate period. Menachem Klein, Professor Menachem Klein of Bar-Ilan University, will then take over and give us a presentation on the Mandate period and the period that he has written about so vividly in his books on the city. And then finally, Mick, who will speak to us. He is a professor in Middle East politics at Exeter and someone deeply familiar with plans to be able to share the city. So with no further ado, let me turn the floor over to Avi Shlaim. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And it is wonderful to see so many of you attending this conference online. The real experts on Jerusalem are the three panelists who are going to follow me. My task, as I understand it, is to put the Jerusalem issue in the much broader context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was made in Britain, and the original scene was the Balfour Declaration. In 1917, the Arabs constituted 90% of the population of Palestine. The Jews constituted 10%, and they owned only 2% of the land. And yet Britain chose to award national rights to the Jewish minority and to deny it to the Arab majority. So this was a classic colonial document. The Balfour Declaration enabled the Zionists to embark on the systematic takeover of Palestine, a protest which is still ongoing today. I can summarize the history of the British mandate in Palestine by saying that Britain stole Palestine from the Palestinians and gave it to the Zionists. And when the Arab Revolt broke out in 1936, it was the British Army which repressed the revolt, which suppressed the revolt with the utmost brutality. The cornerstone of the British mandate for Palestine was that there would be no representative institutions, no democracy until the Jews became the majority. The Palestine mandate was unique. All the other mandates called on the mandatory power to prepare the country for self-government. The Palestine mandate, which incorporated the Balfour Declaration, called on Britain to prepare Palestine to be the country to be governed eventually by Jews from all over the world. Jerusalem is the heart and the core of this conflict. The reason for this is obvious. It is of the utmost importance to all three monotheistic religions, but it is of particularly deep spiritual, religious, symbolic, and political importance to Jews and Arabs. One solution to this problem is internationalization, to make Jerusalem an international city. In 1947, the United Nations voted for the partition of the British mandate into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. But Jerusalem was to be a separate international enclave, a separate, a corpus separatum, but it was not to be. A war broke out, and the war degenerated into a general land grab. The losers in this war were the Palestinians, and the winners were the Israelis, who extended the territory well beyond the UN partition lines, and Jordan, which captured and later annexed the West Bank, including the old city of Jerusalem, to its kingdom. Jerusalem was divided down the middle between the two belligerents. Israel kept West Jerusalem and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan kept East Jerusalem. And this was the status quo until June 1967. Immediately after the Six-Day War, Israel annexed Jerusalem. The first thing to say is that the Israeli annexation of Jerusalem was illegal, and it remains illegal today. Yet the Israeli mantra all along has been that Jerusalem is the unified, eternal capital of the Jewish people. Israel has a record of extreme diplomatic intransigence in all the issues in this conflict, but it has been especially intransigent when it came to Jerusalem. In 1993, Israel and the PLO signed the Oslo Accord. This was a historic accord because it was the first agreement between the two principal sides to the conflict. But the Oslo Accord did not address the issue of Jerusalem, or indeed any other of the what are called permanent status issues. The other permanent status issues are the right of return of the 1948 refugees, the borders of the Palestinian entity, the future of the Jewish settlements on occupied Palestinian territory, and last but not least, the future of Jerusalem. The Oslo peace process failed. There are many reasons for its failure, but the central reason, the most fundamental reason, is that Israel reneged on its side of the deal. Israel did not use the Oslo Accord to end the occupation, but to repackage the occupation. All the final status issues were put at the on the table at the Camp David summit in July 2000. But there were two particularly sensitive issues: the right of return of the Palestinian refugees and Jerusalem. In the end, the conference failed, and the sticking issue at that conference was the issue of Jerusalem. There could be no agreement was reached on what to do with Jerusalem because Israel was intransigent. One more attempt was made to resolve the conflict by President Clinton in December 2000, 1 month before he left the White House. Clinton convened the two delegations and presented to them what he modestly called the Clinton parameters. These parameters envisage an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank, on the whole of the Gaza Strip, and 94 to 96% of the West Bank, with a capital city in East Jerusalem. The principle applied to Jerusalem was that which is Jewish will be like the Jewish quarter, would be under Israeli sovereignty, and that which is Muslim will be under Palestinian sovereignty. But the Clinton parameters were not accepted, and they left office with him. And yet, in historical perspective, this was the real deal of the century. This was the best blueprint we have for a two-state solution. President Trump, of course, has got his own, what he calls pretentiously, with absurd and ridiculous hype, the deal of the century. Before announcing the deal of the century, Trump had already recognized the whole of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. His peace plan was, of course, not a peace plan at all. It was a free pass for Israel to annex about a third of the West Bank. So the Palestinians rejected it angrily, and that was the end of Trump's deal of the century. Yet Trump's plan represents a major American retreat from the idea of a two-state solution to the conflict. And the two-state solution has gathered the broadest possible international consensus, which included most of the Arab states. The Arab states, back in 2002, at the Beirut summit of the Arab League, had launched their own peace initiative, the Saudi Plan, which became the Arab Peace Initiative. The Arab Peace Initiative offered Israel peace and normalization with all 22 members of the Arab League in return for an end of occupation and the emergence of a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, with the capital city in East Jerusalem. But Israel never responded to the Arab Peace Initiative. This too deserved the title of the deal of the century. Today, it is fashionable to say that the two-state solution is dead. I would go much further. I would say that the two-state solution was never born. I say this because at no time since 1967 was Israel serious about allowing an independent Palestinian state, and at no point has America really pushed Israel to agree to a Palestinian state. So what is the solution now? I think that the best solution would be one democratic state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, with equal rights for all its citizens. Sir Vincent is probably going to reprimand me later on for recommending the one-state solution, because the Balfour Project as a whole is still wedded to the two-state solution. But we have to face reality, and the reality is that Israel, by its constant expansion of settlements, has killed the possibility of a viable Palestinian state. You may say one state, one binational state with equal rights for all its citizens is pie in the sky. So I refer you to the book by Menachem Klein, Common Lives, Jews and Arabs in Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Hebron. His book shows quite clearly that peaceful coexistence between Jews and Arabs in Jerusalem was possible in the past, and if it was possible in the past, it should be possible in the present and in the future. So I conclude, as a historian of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as somebody who always supported the two-state solution in the past, I have now reached the conclusion that the only just solution to this conflict is one democratic state. And I recommend this to all the listeners, not just as a practical solution to the Jerusalem problem, but as a noble vision. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Avi. That was a really profound point that you ended on. And speaking for myself, I think that I would agree with you that that is the right way to proceed. Whether it is practical, I'm not sure, but certainly it is the direction of travel that I think many believe is the right way to go. I'm not certain yet whether Salim Tamari has been able to join us. He was having some technical difficulties, I believe. So we might move quickly to Menachem, who you have already referenced. So perhaps, Diana, if you could bring in Menachem Klein.
Good morning. Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well, Menachem, so please continue.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much. I would like to start with two historical shifts that happened in Jerusalem, Greater Jerusalem, I mean, the Ottoman district of Jerusalem in the late 19th century. First, Jerusalem started to expand outside the walls. Jerusalemites lived the walled city, and they created a modern city before World War I and also afterwards. And second, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, a local identity emerged among the Jerusalemites, a local patriotism of belonging to the city and seeing their citizens, or the Jews and Arabs saw their neighbors not as Jews versus Arabs versus Christians, but as Jerusalemites, people that share the same land. They spoke the same language, in most cases Arabic. Even Ashkenazi Jews spoke Arabic, and they have shared interest and the shared identity within the Ottoman Empire. They did not revolt against the Ottoman Empire, but they preserved their own identity as Jerusalemites. And this is a big shift towards modernity by both Jews and Arabs, and both of them developed Jerusalem and moved it to become a very modern city in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. Now, which means that Jerusalem became a modern city, not only a holy place. So the way that the Jerusalemites saw their own place was not just religion, holy place, sacred space, but also a modern city. And city that people lived in, connected to the West, connected to the region. There were no borders between Jerusalem, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, even Iraq or Turkey, and not only a place that two rivals, religions or empires fight over ruling it. Now, it is important to bear in mind that the mainstream Zionists did not see Jerusalem as a major place. For the mainstream Zionism, Jerusalem was not important. They identified Jerusalem as a holy place, but the Zionists as a secular movement, as a secular national movement, did not consider Jerusalem as a center. So they neglected Jerusalem. In their imagination, it was identified with the ultra-Orthodox that they revolt against, with the exile, with the old Jews, and we want to establish the new Jew. So at the end of the early 20th century, we see the establishment of two national movements. Each national movement was ethno-exclusive national movement, wanting to rule exclusively the area. And here comes the Balfour Declaration. If we look back from today's discourse of one state versus two-state solution, we can say that the Balfour Declaration is in favor of one state. Of course, it is a Jewish state. One state solution. This was the Balfour Declaration solution, the cooperation between the Zionist movement and the British colonialism. Jewish hegemony, no Palestinians, and the local people were classified as Muslims or Christians only. No local identity. The Balfour architects did not acknowledge the local identity of the people living on the place. The two national movements aimed to undermine this identity. They wanted to replace this identity with their exclusive agenda, ethno-exclusive agenda. Did they succeed? If we look back from today or from 1948 war, they succeeded in destroying the old order, definitely, but they could not achieve what each of them wanted, an exclusive new order, national rule, either Palestinian or Jewish. So at the end, what happened is that the Brits in 1937 suggested the partition plan. And the different version became recognized by the UN internationally and accepted internationally in 1947. So the vision of Palestine, a kind of a two-state solution, was accepted in 47 against the one-state Jewish hegemony of the Balfour Statement. Now, if we look back, go back to from the national movements, the national perspective to the city of Jerusalem, the lives under the British mandate, the life in Jerusalem was managed in two levels. At the popular level, the two people, the two nations cohabited, and everyday life went normal. Sometimes there were clashes in 1920, 29, but shortly afterwards, they lived together in the same place, interact. There were mixed marriage, and they met each other in the public space, and so on, up to 45, 48, up to the war. However, in the municipality, in the institutions and the municipal institutions and nationwide, there was an escalating a clash between the two national movements. So in Jerusalem, because of the centrality that the Jerusalem was the center of the British administration, and the city council that the Brits artificially wanted to keep a balance between the two national movements, maintain as an artificial balance between Jews and Arabs in the city hall, and failed. The city hall was paralyzed. It was a platform of clashes between the Zionists and the Palestinians. Regardless, it was the Khalidi or Nashashibi and the Husseini trying to undermine both of these clans, and of course the Jews, the Jewish members of the city hall. So the city suffered from a very hot clash in the city hall, in the institutions, but down in the streets, they managed. It shows that the Jerusalemites are more, let's say, sophisticated or wise than their leaders. And it's true also up to date. I think anyone who follows what's going on the ground in the city see that the conflict is not elsewhere, and there are many areas even today that Jews and Arabs cooperate, not only against COVID-19, but also on daily life. So this kind of difference between the national conflict and lives on the ground, it is relevant also up to date. Finally, Jerusalem was divided between Jordan and Israel in 48, based on the understanding, and thank you, Avi, for teaching us from your first book, Collusion Over the Jordan, due to the understanding between Zionist leadership, Ben-Gurion, and Israel and Jordan. Jerusalem was divided between Jordan and Israel in 48 war. This division ended of course, in 67. And since then, Israel occupies Jordanian Jerusalem, Palestinian Jerusalem, but still de facto on the ground, there are many areas that are divided between Jews and Arabs, or Israel actually discriminates the Arab parts of Jerusalem. Can we go back to the two states or two cities solution? It's, in my view, and perhaps I open it for further debate, it's impossible to build a Berlin Wall or a kind of a wall of total separation between Jewish neighborhoods and the Palestinian neighborhoods. Under any circumstances, there must be a kind of what I call confederational arrangements between the Israeli entity and the Palestinian entity, sharing the same urban space. So it is, of course, it is possible today, based on following what was possible late 19th century, early 20th century, with all the changes that happened in between the two periods. But still, we have local identity as Jerusalemites that push the Jews and the Palestinians, the two sides, to cooperate and share the same space. Okay, thank you very much.
Andrew, you're muted. Andrew, you're still muted. Andrew, it might help if you press the space bar. That might unmute you while you talk. Andrew, would you like me to ask Mick to move ahead and carry on? Mick Dumper, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you. Sorry, technical difficulties. All right, carry on. Bye.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning to my fellow panelists and to all of you who have turned up for this session. As we haven't yet heard from Salim, I'm not sure how long we've got to the end of the panel. I think we're due to finish at 11:20, and I don't know if you want me to keep some time to have Salim in, or shall I extend my presentation a little bit longer? Andrew, if you can hear me, can you just put a thumbs up or down? Thumbs up? Okay. So do I carry on? Okay.
Yes, please.
All right. Okay. So my little presentation will really bring to a close this historical section, but it'll bring it right up to the present day. But it also obviously links to the past, because when you're talking about Jerusalem, you can never get away from the historical legacy of the city. I'm briefly going to concentrate on the holy sites as an example of some of the contentious contemporary issues. I know later on in the day you'll be having Danny Zeiderman giving a much fuller exposition. And I'm going to focus here perhaps on the role of the holy sites in some of the negotiations and the search for a peaceful resolution. In this way, I'm trying to stick close to the theme of the conference, but also to provide a kind of bridge to the sessions later on in the day. Now, I'll try and share with you my screen. It's always a bit tricky, this bit. I think this is the one.
Mick, you've got something perhaps jiggling. It's making a tapping sound. I don't know if...
No, that's not me. It's silent here.
All right, okay.
I'm in the middle of Devon. There's not a sound.
A woodpecker or something. All right, thank you.
Okay. So I just want to just show some maps to give you an idea of what we're talking about. If we start sort of from 48, the period that Menachem was talking about, through to 67, you can see here the green line, the old city in the middle, and these are the yellow areas are the areas of Palestinian residents. If you move on a little bit, you'll see in 67, a new border of Jerusalem was created, which acquired or annexed certain parts of the West Bank and made that part of the greater Jerusalem. And then over the following 60 odd years, you had a whole series of Israeli settlements, these blue blocks being implanted on the other side. And you can see kind of the huge demographic changes that have taken place. And in this map, you should be able to see the proposed wall, or the wall in existence, and some of the extensions to the wall that are planned. So Jerusalem is undergoing dramatic changes, and there's lots of issues, both on about demography, about the scale of the new borders, the direction of them, the kind of governance over the city, and to what extent is the international community going to be involved in its future. I can't cover all of these issues. I teach a course on Jerusalem and it takes weeks, so in 10 minutes I can't really cover them all now. So I'm just going to quickly look at the holy places and the old city and refer to a number of the discussions around their future. As you all know, and Menachem and Avi have spoken, Jerusalem's a center for Islam, Christianity and Judaism. And here we have the kind of well-known pictures of some sites. There are over 300 sites in the old city alone. That's probably roughly every 4 meters a holy site. This is chock-a-block with different, from prayer rooms to churches to mosques to seminaries to synagogues. And sometimes they're right next to each other, sometimes on top of each other, sometimes they're intertwined with each other. And you can imagine, even in the happiest of circumstances, how difficult it is to keep a kind of a harmonious interaction between them. And these sites also provide communities with a very strong sense of their territorial presence and reinforces sort of the ethnic divisions between them. And it's also important to remember these sites are controlled by clergy who are quite powerful and who have international connections. And so whatever goes on in Jerusalem immediately kind of resonates around the world. There's a lot of media interest straight away. It's a city in the spotlight all the time. The key focus of much of the tension has been in the area known as the Temple Mount, or the Haram al-Sharif, which is where you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, the Neel al-Marwani Prayer Hall, which is underneath this paving area here, the Golden Gate, which has more recently become an issue. Somewhere along here is where the presumed place of the Holy of Holies from the ancient biblical period. You have the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, down here, and then a tunnel that runs along the edge of the Haram al-Sharif, known as the Western Wall Tunnel, and which has now become part of a national shrine in Israel. So this is kind of the epicenter of a lot of the tension, but we shouldn't really forget, all around Jerusalem, the old city, there are other sites which are quite well known, and I can't go through all of them, and I'm sure Danny Zeiderman will give you much more detail than me. I just mentioned here the Mamilla Cemetery and the Mount Zion Dawoodi complex, as well as the Jewish cemetery here on the other side. Now, when it comes to peace plans, what we're really, there's more or less 4 options. You can divide them into sort of 4 groups. If this is the hard border between Israel and Palestine, and I'm talking about peace plans around Jerusalem, one set of options is that Israel has held control of the old city, and so the border goes to the east of the old city. The opposite option to that is that Palestine has control of the old city and the border goes to the west of the old city. Now, these two are obviously not acceptable to either side, but that's where much of the debate is taken. What we have here in these two, the lower options here, is where there is a zone created around the old city, which is in some senses shared or has a third party looking after it for a temporary period until a resolution is arrived at. Or you have a version of this, which is that there's an open border, and some sort of compromise over the kind of the main areas around functional issues and security, but there's no sort of clear division of sovereignty. And these are kind of the more or less the 4 options that most of the Jerusalem plans fall into. In the year 2000, when Clinton hosted the Camp David discussions, the Israeli proposal was more or less this, that if this is the old city, it would push the border way to the east, and these areas would become part of Palestinian Jerusalem. And this was obviously in the end unacceptable, and it was the main reason which the Camp David proposed negotiations broke down. What I want to look at is 2 initiatives that try to find a way around this impasse. And in a way, I feel I'm speaking slightly out of turn here, because Menachem Klein has had much more direct experience as a participant in these discussions than I have. I was more involved in the Josie one, but Menachem has had experience of both of those. So if I look at the Jerusalem Old City Initiative, there is a website there, and there is also, if you can see, this book, came out last year, which is a detailed description of how the negotiations went. And it was initiated by a group of former Canadian diplomats and academics. And they decided that the old city where the holy places were, or the key holy places, was the nut that had to be cracked. It had to sort that one out. And they felt that what was important, if you could sort out the old city and how that was going to be governed, other things would fall into place much more easily. And they went for something called an international regime that would be backed by a UN Security Council resolution. The whole question of sovereignty was put to one side. Whether it belonged to the Israelis or the Palestinians, they thought would not be an issue, should not be discussed at that point. The regime, they suggested, should last for about 10 years, which is incidentally very similar to the partition plan proposal 47. And then there should be a review and perhaps elections after 10 years. The proposals in this initiative focus a lot on security and safety and access to the holy sites. And there was a sort of how I was sort of asked to develop some of these ideas. And we came up with a sort of a 4-pillar model. There'd be an old city administration with a holy sites police unit, which would be international and comprising both parties. There'll be an interreligious council, and there'll be specialized working groups on archaeology, on land disputes, and justice. But that would be kind of the basic structure. Now, there were problems about this, and one of them was that the suspension of sovereignty was a big issue, because, as we all know, in international relations, when both parties accept something, even on a temporary basis, that becomes the new status quo. And the thought of suspending sovereignty was very unpalatable to the Palestinians, who wanted at least some recognition that if they didn't attain sovereignty, it was still there to be discussed. And also, there was a sense in which the old city would be detached from its hinterland. It would create another mini municipality within the bigger city, and there would be checkpoints as you go in and out of the old city, which would fragment the city even more. Elements of the Josie initiative have been discussed at very high level. They were part of the material that was submitted to the participants of the Annapolis conference in 2007, and it still remains on the table as one of the sort of few proposals which have tried to spell out the consequences of a compromise over the governance of the holy sites. The other initiative was called the Geneva Initiative, launched in 2003. It didn't have a particular official status, but Palestinian and Israeli figures in both Camp David and Taba were very involved in these on a personal capacity, and it reflected kind of the thinking at that time. And the areas of agreement would be that there were 2 capitals and 2 municipalities. There'd be a coordination committee between them. There would be also a special regime for the old city, very similar to the Josie ideas. And there'd be Palestinian sovereignty over Haram al-Sharif. In exchange, Palestinians would cede sovereignty to the Jewish quarter and many of the Israeli settlements. The Geneva Initiative, again, is still out there. There's still, at time to time, there's people working on some elements of it to try and reconcile some of the differences. The main problem is that it really reflected the balance of power at the time, and Palestinians who had welcomed it started to pull away from it because they felt that it too much entrenched the Israeli dominance. It also had the problem of fragmenting the city, and you can see from this map here, this would have been the borders trying to incorporate the Israeli settlements. So you have these sort of corridors, which is really, and tunnels and bypasses, which was really a security expert's nightmare. And the question of dividing up the old city into a Palestinian area and Israeli area was quite unacceptable to the Palestinians at that time. So when I kind of look at some of these peace plans and take these two as an example, I try and pick out what is agreed and what needs still to work on. And this is a very rough, quite cosmetic list here. It's much more nuanced than this, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot of some of where we are in terms of the discussions, or where we have been. At the moment, all the discussions are suspended. So there's more or less an agreement that there would be some sort of dual municipal structure, and that there would be special arrangements for the old city and the holy places. To be still, clarified, but that's still more or less people see that as the direction of travel. There would be some third party, some international role for verification, for providing security, and there might be some land swaps. What isn't sorted is the sovereignty of the old city over the western, in the old city over the Western Wall and the Haram al-Sharif, and how the different areas of the city link up together. What sort of what they call contiguity mechanisms? Do they have borders or tunnels or special bypasses and bridges? And the exact line of the municipal borders is still to be decided. Some people prefer a small border. Others say, no, let's have a larger one, because then there'd be much more scope for the city to have its own kind of legal and administrative system. And the whole issue of...
Sorry to interrupt you, but Salim Tamari has been able to join us now, and I'd like to give him a little bit of time before we close, so that we can have a short discussion. So if you could kindly start wrapping up.
Yeah, definitely. There's two other elements: is to what extent would the Palestinian security services be involved in the security of the area, and what happens to Palestinian property in West Jerusalem in this scenario. I won't go into this because I'm sure you'll have chances to speak, but obviously this is a bit of a spanner in the works, and there are a number of issues around what the US has done, and it'll be very interesting to see if Biden reverses any of these steps taken by the Trump administration. Just to say that it's not at all clear what the US recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel actually means in practice and on the ground. There's lots of procedural problems that diplomats are working with. I'll stop here, and thank you very much, Andrew. Nice to see Menachem and Avi again, and hello to all the participants. Bye.
Thank you very much indeed, Mick. I mean, that was really authoritative. I'm glad to say that Salim has now been able to join us. And so, Salim, if you could kindly unmute yourself, we'll give you the floor now. Yep, we hear you now. Thanks, Salim.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we were confused by the summertime. I have designed to do it an hour from now, but we might as well go ahead. Do you have my PowerPoint, or shall I do it from here?
I think best for you to do it from there.
I think it's too much technology, so I'll just read from my presentation. Is that okay?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I intend to discuss the centrality of Jerusalem in the late Ottoman period and the way the idea of a Palestine entity evolved in reaction to the events following the Egyptian campaign in Syria, in which the separation of Syria from the Ottoman Empire elicited a number of reactions, one of which was the opening up of Jerusalem for substantial presence by the European powers, especially the Germans, the Russians, the British, and the French, with a considerable amount of educational institutions and healthcare by the Vatican and the Catholic forces. During this period, Jerusalem became a separate autonomous province called Mutasarriflik of Qudus Sharif, or Holy Jerusalem in the Ottoman Empire. And it also led to a substantial amount of competition for in which the various European consulates and European missions began to establish their presence in a way that challenged Ottoman rule. The presentation I had prepared, which I'm unable to share with you here, discusses how this correspondence between a greater Jerusalem entity and the Ottoman definition of Philistine in Syria became more or less synonymous. And we can trace it very much in the cartography and the travel literature of the period. There are two items which interest in this vision. One is the great preponderance of literature which is known as Fada'il al-Quds, or the vices, the virtues of Jerusalem in Arab and Islamic, including Turkish Islamic, celebration of the importance of Jerusalem as part of travel to the Holy Land. And there's a profuse literature going back to the 16th century, but it became very preponderant in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. The Ottoman mapping of Syria was part of the campaign in which the naval expeditions of the Ottoman Empire, beginning with Peri Reisi in the 16th century and Katib Shalabi in the 17th century, created commercial and military mapping of Syria, as well as the rest of the Mediterranean, for the purposes of asserting Ottoman naval ascendancy. The part of which deals with Jerusalem and Palestine is significant because, beginning with Peri Reisi in the late 16th century, we see visually dramatic, commercially useful, and militarily instrumental allocations of boundaries and areas of urban expansion in Ottoman mapping. For the first time, we see urban maps of major provincial cities, and of course, Jerusalem was part of it. In my intended PowerPoint, I show the evolution of the growth of the Jerusalem district of the province of Jerusalem in an increasingly sophisticated way in these mappings going back to the late 16th century, early 17th century, and then joined by the Khedival mapping services. Of course, Egypt was then nominally an Ottoman province, and Egyptian Khedival cartography was seen as part of the Ottoman cartography, although, of course, Egyptian interest after Muhammad Ali's campaign became distinct and separate and competitive. So the net result of these competing interests over Jerusalem, first by the European powers after the Egyptian campaign, and second by the Ottoman administration in response to these European claims over the holy places, redefined what Jerusalem was and evolved a kind of Jerusalem entity which reached its zenith by two events. The first was the establishment of an autonomous Jerusalem province in the 1870s. And this was one of the few autonomous provinces in the Ottoman region, the other one being in the Arab world, the Mutasarrifiyya of Jabal Lubnan. And second, the creation in 1872 of three different sanjaks which joined together what became later known as the Palestinian districts of Akka, Nablus, and Jerusalem. That is, the province of Jerusalem was joined with the sanjak of Akka and Nablus to form one single unit, which was called the Province of Jerusalem District, and European powers called it the Autonomous Region of Palestine. The word Palestine was used by the European powers, and in Istanbul, both the words Philistine and Qudus Sharif were used for the creation of this separate unit corresponding to the autonomous zone of Mount Lebanon. This district, or three sanjaks combined into one, making one single Palestinian province under the wilaya of Suraya Pasha, who was the governor of Aleppo and then the governor of Syria, now became the governor of Palestine, did not last long. It lasted very briefly, maybe for a year and a half, before the redistricting of the area joined the northern part of Palestine to Beirut Wilaya, and the central part remained as the District of Palestine. What is significant in all of this is that in Ottoman cartography and Ottoman administrative usages, Palestine was Jerusalem, Jerusalem was Palestine, meaning that the head of the province, which had port city of Jaffa and the city of Jerusalem in it, were one single province that were marked as Philistine in Ottoman cartography. And that remained the condition until the coming of the First World War. During the war, we have very interesting development in which Ottoman Turkish administrative boundaries shifted again with the creation of one single province extending from Sur in southern Lebanon to Rafah in the south. In military cartography, which is enunciated in a very important document, which was a manual for military use called Philistine Risalisi, and it was authored, according to my investigation, by Mohammed Bahjat and by Mohammed Bahjat, the cartographer and ethnographer. And that corresponded to a new entity called Palestine. It's clearly marked as Philistine, and the capital of that region was the city of Jerusalem. So this progression from a marginal physical administrative boundaries of the pilgrimage center known as Jerusalem, and enunciated and elaborated in the literature known as Fada'il al-Quds, now evolved in competition with the claims of the European powers, leading later, of course, to a Tsarist French and British claims over Palestine, as well as German interests who were by then allied with the British, created a larger Palestinian entity with Jerusalem as its center. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that the creation of the Balfour Project in Britain did not come suddenly. It came from a larger number of attempts by European powers to establish themselves in the Jerusalem district for the whole of Palestine, and not only for the greater Jerusalem area, and responded to by Ottoman assertion of Jerusalem as the holy. Of course, Jerusalem was Qudus Sharif, and it was in Ottoman literature, administrative interest, equal to, but now superior to, the connection with the Hijaz. That, of course, collapsed completely during the war, giving way to the Franco-British occupation of Palestine and the establishment, and then the separation of spheres of power between Britain and France, and the establishment of British interest in Palestine and the League of Nations mandate and the introduction of the Balfour Declaration. My point here is that the Ottomans were very keen at countering what became the Balfour Declaration, before it was Balfour, through the assertion of claims by the Germans, who were their allies, by the French, by the Italians, especially by the Russians, for control over the Holy Land. And they did this by expanding the area of the Jerusalem all the way to the Sur boundaries in southern Lebanon. So I will end my talk by saying that the centrality of Jerusalem in the Ottoman discourse was asserted through travel literature, through religious literature, through establishment of pilgrimage routes, through the connection of the economic network between the port city of Jaffa and Jerusalem, and finally by military administrative means of creating one single entity of Palestine in 1915, which of course collapsed in December of 1917.
Thank you very much indeed, Salim. We're enormously relieved that you were able to join us for that extremely rich history, but also because you are the Palestinian representative on this panel, and we needed to hear your voice. Colleagues, we're running a little bit late now, partly because of the technical problems that we had, including my own, and I must apologize to everyone for that. Unfortunately, I lost the link at one stage and couldn't hear what was going on and had to rejoin. So I'm going to cut the discussion short because we're approaching the end of this panel. And I'm simply going to ask one question, which I would like everyone to answer briefly. It's the same question to all of you. And I would be grateful if we could take it in turns, that you will simply ask the question of what lessons can you draw from past attempts to share the city or to divide the city for today? Are any of those lessons from past experience, of which Mick went through it in some detail, still relevant today? Avi referred to the Clinton parameters, but he also expressed his own doubts about the viability or the prospects for a two-state solution. So is it useful for us to be able to try to draw any lessons from history for policymakers today? Perhaps, Avi, you could start. If you, Avi, please unmute yourself. You're still on mute, Avi. Okay.
Okay. So at the heart of this conflict is a clash between two national movements. And these two national movements have found it impossible to come to terms over Jerusalem. Nationalism is a very exclusive force, very powerful force, and a dividing force. It divides us into us and them. And that is the fundamental problem, not just in Jerusalem, but across the board. So the lessons of history are two, which is the two national movements have never been able to come to a compromise over Jerusalem. And the second lesson is the great powers who have been unceasingly involved in this conflict have also had their own separate national interest and were unable to promote a joint solution to the conflict. That is why my conclusion is that all other attempts to resolve the Jerusalem problems have failed, and the only one is to share Jerusalem in the context of a binational state from the river to the sea.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Menachem and hear his thoughts.
Thank you. Okay, my answer is as following. Regardless which type of state we will have between Israel-Palestine, in Israel-Palestine, the city cannot be divided by a wall. The citizens of Jerusalem showed in the past and definitely need to cooperate, encounter, collaborate, and share the urban space which they mix together, and it's impossible to divide it. And it has to be a share between two equal partners. One should not rule over the other. So equality and sharing are the key concepts towards a much better and different future.
You've expressed the philosophy of the Balfour Project very well. Let me turn to Mick.
Hi, yeah, I follow on from what Menachem and Navi have said, actually. One thing that is missing in a lot of the discussions about the future of the city is a recognition of the urban dynamics of the city. Cities are a multi-ethnic, heterogeneous mix. And to try and to allow or to create a system where one community dominates the other will lead to a ghettoization and marginalization of different elements, and it kills the city. It deprives the city of its vitality and its cosmopolitanism. And much of the discussions seem to neglect that and seem to sort of see the city as a map through which they can draw lines, which may correspond to some security or some sort of demographic issue, but don't see the city as a whole, where the different parts of it and the different ethnicities and confessions and subgroups all contribute to making it a vital and lively place. So in a sense, I'm following on from Menachem and Navi in that sense. There is something intrinsically heterogeneous about a city which isn't reflected in a lot of the discussions that we're having about the future of the city.
Yeah. Salim, you're a Jerusalemite and have studied the city most of your life. What lessons do you draw from the past, and what future do you see?
It's very difficult to draw lessons when you are inside the grim reality of the city today. But I want to project something from what is being said. First, I think the excessive sacralization of the city has been a major impediment to any kind of political reconciliation, because when religion rules, then it becomes an overwhelming ideological factor excluding the others, because all, especially in the Jewish claims and Islamic claims of the city, the idea of territorial division has been anathema. And that is why I think sacralization has been a negative factor in attempting to find a solution. The second point is that the existing demography of the city, which was referred to by the three speakers, or at least the part that I listened to, is a de facto factor against the existing form of apartheid that's being run, and cannot be squared with any kind of democratic control or any kind of political control that relies on disenfranchisement. So we need a solution that will address the demographic control in a representative factor without even looking at wider solutions of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the third point is that the earlier partition plan condition of internationalization, which failed, of course, in 1947 and after the 48 and 67 war, today it sounds very attractive way of intervention, since neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians are able, given the imbalance of forces, to resolve their condition. And therefore, it has weight and possibilities of intervention that make it palatable, make it interesting to rethink as in the medium term future to look at internationalization.
Thank you very much indeed, Salim, and to all of you for really a great